Now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. While in our culture we're busy taking down and storing the lights, dragging the tree out to the curb and weaning ourselves off of holiday delicacies, in other parts of the world, the grandest celebrations are still fresh. Christmas Day already seems like it was months ago, but Epiphany was just this past Thursday, and for many residents of the world, it is the larger celebration. Gifts are given, decorations adorn homes, celebrations spring up everywhere for the celebration that remembers the visit of the Magi to the baby Jesus. The birth of the Christ child is a splendid beginning, goes the thinking. But at Epiphany, we begin to really see who this child is. We begin to really see the good news of God among us. So Epiphany is most worthy of celebration. But I don't know about you, but my celebrator is all out of fuel about this time. I just dragged the boxes of ornaments back down to the basement. I'm all set on cookies and confections for a good long while now. So how about instead of another major celebration, what if we just simplify today? Have you ever seen one of those quizzes? Which Disney character are you? Or which Star Wars or Harry Potter character are you? Those are always fun. So how about if we just make our celebration of Epiphany an asking of which Epiphany character are we? In the story of the Magi visiting the Christ child, we can rule out at the very outset that our place is that of Jesus. This is a sometimes dangerous interpretive move, as to read any sacred story from the Gospels and say, that's what Jesus did, therefore that is what I must do, can be problematic. To be sure, we are followers in the way of Christ, but we must be careful not to make ourselves one and the same with Christ. Our interpretive decision in this case, though, is even easier than that. In this story, Jesus is entirely passive. He is the adored one, but he doesn't actually do anything in the Epiphany story. So let's not take that place. Perhaps we do better to see ourselves as the Magi themselves. They're rugged travelers having come from somewhere in the east. We can't be sure exactly where. With all respect to the famous hymn, they weren't kings. They were more likely sorcerers or diviners of some sort. Astrologers would be a good guess, given their penchant for watching the skies and following stars. At any rate, they've been given the ability to recognize the birth of a king so notable that they come from afar to pay homage to this new ruler. Again, tradition tells us there were three. Almost certainly this could not have been what Matthew intended. Just because there were three gifts does not mean there were only three wise men. Indeed, a journey of such distance as they were said to have traveled would have required an entire convoy of travelers. So we do better to imagine a caravan of so-called wise men, perhaps even with their families, and certainly with their animals of burden, and of course, treasure chests full of gifts. Wouldn't we like to fit in as those who gather in community to bear up the weight of our collective riches and bear them at great effort to God? And we may well do that. But that actually isn't Matthew's focal point here. In a story that situates Jesus' birth firmly within the context of the broader story of Jewish history, these men are Gentiles. And they come from some unknown part of the world so out there as to not even be mentioned. And they certainly have nothing to do with the son of the great King David, now lying in the manger. No, the point that Matthew has begun to make, and will do so more explicitly later in the gospel, is that this new king will graft the nobodies into this story so that they have as much to do with it as the somebodies. And to gather as mainline American Christians in a warm building or through our various electronic devices, and to read ourselves into the story as the outsiders could be as problematic as reading ourselves as Jesus. So maybe instead we should read ourselves in a cautionary place in the story. Perhaps we're not at our best perhaps we are not at our best, and thus could perhaps read ourselves into the role of Herod. He was a master of getting his way. Physical history in Palestine remembers him well and fondly. He was known for his tremendous building projects throughout the land, which were, history tells us, each crafty ways of appeasing different constituencies. A massive expansion of the temple to Yahweh in Jerusalem, and major tributes to Roman deities in other cities. You see, Herod's place as Roman-appointed governor was always tenuous. And so he governed out of fear. When appeasement didn't work, he was no stranger to violence for the sake of holding on to power. We learn a bit later in the gospel, in fact, that his sending the Magi to report back on the whereabouts of this newborn king is actually a part of a half-baked murderous plan. We are reminded again this week with the passing of the first anniversary of the U.S. Capitol riots, that we humans are wont at times to hold on to power by any means necessary, even by violence. But lest we miss the plank in our own eye, let us remember that the state for which that capital stands, that we, the people, also ensure our security and wealth through violent means. So yes, there is something of valuable caution for us in the person of Herod. But I don't know on this day of celebration if I'm quite ready to say that we hold precisely that place in the story. And so, the chief priests and the scribes offer a final place for us to stand within the story. This is their first appearance in the Gospel of Matthew. Later in the narrative, Matthew will pit them against Jesus as protectors of tradition merely for the sake of tradition. And here in this encounter, that role is fulfilled only passively. They, as the principal religious leaders and scholars of the Jewish people, are called on here for information. Threatened, Herod would call on the scribes and priests to inquire about some specifics of the expected coming of the Messiah, this king born among them, so he could rush this problematic rumor in its infancy. It is interesting, though. The scribes and priests were the ones whose lives were oriented around the hope of God coming into the world, but they were not the ones preparing to go and see. The keepers of the tradition were so steeped so deeply in their tradition that they could not recognize the fulfillment of that tradition in the world, even when some astrologers from the East came and told them of it. How tragic it would be if this were our place in the story. If we gathered in our place of worship, retelling the story over and over, going back and forth about what it all means. Now, don't get me wrong. To gather and to go over and over the story is a very good thing, unless the very good thing we're hoping for is already taking place out there, and we're missing it because we're too busy getting ready for it in here. That would be a tragedy. So we can't let that become our place in the story. No, we serve ourselves and God best not to take this role or the role of Herod. We might like to think of ourselves as the Magi, but we don't seem to fit Matthew's intent for their place in the story. And of course, the role of Messiah is one best left to the living God. So we'll not assume that one either. So it is that we have exhausted the characters in the story and not found a single place we would like to claim as our own. Surely, we must have overlooked something. We must have made a glaring omission somewhere. I know we must have. These things always tend to hide in plain sight. In plain sight. Maybe that's it. The most visible element of the entire story, bright and shining there in the night sky. Star of wonder, star of night, star with royal beauty bright. There is one place in this story we may occupy well by God's grace. A herald that the waiting is over and God has come among us. Westward leading, still proceeding, guiding to thy perfect light. Yes, the guide to the Magi, the shining emblem that hope is alive. Could we, take that place in the story? In this modern reliving of the Jesus story that is our lives, could we, just a single congregation, in the midst of a troubled city, could we perhaps be the guiding light which announces to the world that God has come among us? Could we, by adorning ourselves not with fear as Herod or senseless tradition as the scribes, but with hope enough to fill the night sky, become a beacon for weary seekers? If those who've been told they have to be a certain thing or act a certain way or possess certain qualities in order to be known to this little child, in order to offer their gifts, were to look up, could we be there to guide them home? Even this place in the story will be a difficult one to fulfill. But is there a better place for us to occupy than to be they whose light illumines the way for those who wish to know? Christmas has come.